Hello again. This is a continuum of the signs of the latter days and Jesus Christ coming. And the next event I'm going to talk about is the League of Nations and the United Nations. The nations all coming together is another sign of the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. Jesus told us that there would be world government and all the nations would come together and be ruled by one man, the Antichrist. As I mentioned in several verses, you can see that happening. The League of Nations was one of the first attempts, well, one of the first large, big attempts, to push that agenda forward at a more rapid pace. While the First World War was still raging, some world leaders, namely Woodrow Wilson, had an idea of a League of Nations, which purpose was to prevent another world war, disarm nations, promote rights, promote and encourage use of diplomacy rather than war, and other things like that. That was what it was designed for. But it was never going to really do that. The League came into reality a few years after World War I, but this body of nations didn't prevent the future Second World War that came on 20 years later. It couldn't even prevent Italy and Japan's aggression in the interwar years. Italy's attack on Ethiopia. Ethiopia actually pleaded with the League of Nations for help, and the League really did nothing. Maybe, I don't even remember, I don't even know if they said anything really to Italy. And then later on, Italy started attacking Manchuria and parts of China, and they actually condemned Japan for what they were doing, but Japan was there and just simply stated that they just basically walked out on them and just said, we don't really care what you say, we're not leaving Manchuria, we're done with the League of Nations. That's pretty much what Japan did. It was nothing more than a step in moving towards the coming world government. And they just basically did nothing. So the League of Nations proved to be a pretty weak body. The concept of a peaceful community of nations has been proposed as far back as 1795, when Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch, outlined the idea of a League of Nations to control conflict and promote peace between states. Kant argued for the establishment of a peaceful world community, not in the sense of a global government, but in the hope that each state would declare itself a free state that respects its citizens and welcomes foreign visitors as fellow rational beings, thus promoting peaceful social society worldwide. Which is not what's going to happen when the world government gets started. International cooperation to promote collective security originated in the concert of Europe that developed after the Napoleonic Wars in the 19th century, in an attempt to maintain the status quo between European states and so avoid war. This period also saw the development of international law, with the first Geneva Conventions establishing laws dealing with humanitarian relief during wartime, and the International Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 governing rules of war, and the peaceful settlement of international disputes. All this, most of the time, a group of nations coming together, has all been about preventing big wars, trying to prevent wars and promote peace. That's what the big thing is, what it's all about. But that may be what some people actually want to be about and actually want to use it for, but it's not going to end up that way. And a lot of them in the behind the scenes really don't care about that. They're interested in one thing: setting up a world government, getting all the nations together, dissolving borders, making it all one big happy little family that they control. That's really what it's about. The forerunner of the League of Nations, the Interparliamentary Union, was formed by peace activists William Randall Kramer and Frederick Passy in 1889. The organization was international in scope, with a third of the members of parliaments in the 24 countries that had parliaments serving as members of the IPU by 1914. Its aims were to encourage governments to solve international disputes by peaceful means. As you can see, this has been going on for a while. Everybody's government leaders have been trying to bring the nations together in some kind of union. Annual conferences were held to help governments refine the process of international arbitration. Its structure consisted of a council headed by a president, which would later be reflected in the structure of the League. At the start of the 20th century, two power blocks emerged from alliances between the European great powers. It was these alliances that, at the start of the First World War in 1914, drew all the major European powers into the conflict. This was the first major war in Europe being between industrialized countries. Before that, before this, there was industrial weapons at the time, because in the Civil War, that's when they first come out with rifles, shells. But there was still some artillery way back, but it wasn't used. It had never been used at the large scale of the First World War. It was used on a massive scale. There were some major technological advances in weaponry in the First World War that never had been seen before. And in the beginning of the war, most people wasn't even thinking about it being as bad as it was going to be. They still had cavalry running around. The Germans, one of theirs was called the Hussaren, or Hoosiers. They were a light cavalry brigade. And then there's another one, I can't remember the name, there's another one just called, it's like the heavy cavalry. And the Russians still had it, and many other nations still had the cavalry that would charge in, the brigades and everything. And they had never seen the artillery that had been seen. And they had never seen the industrialized power that they had no idea. They didn't know how powerful their artillery was until they actually got to until they actually was unleashed on them. This was the first major war in Europe between industrialized countries, and the first time in Western Europe that the results of industrialization, for example mass production, had been dedicated to war. The result of this industrialized warfare was an unprecedented casualty level: 8.5 million soldiers killed, and an estimated 21 million wounded, and approximately 10 million civilians dead. By the time the fighting ended in November 1918, the war had had a profound impact, affecting the social, political, and economic systems of Europe, and inflicting psychological and physical damage. Anti-war sentiment rose around the world, across the world. The First World War was described as the war to end all wars, and its possible causes was vigorously investigated. The causes identified including arms races, alliances, secret diplomacies, and the freedom of sovereign states to enter into war for their own benefit. One proposed remedy was the creation of an international organization whose aim was to prevent future war through disarmament, only diplomacy, international cooperation, restrictions on the rights to wage war, and penalties that made war unattractive. While the First World War was still underway, a number of governments and groups had already started developing plans to change the way international relations were carried out and to try to prevent another conflict. United States President Woodrow Wilson and his advisor, Colonel Edward M. House, enthusiastically promoted the idea of a league as a means of avoiding any repetition of the bloodshed of the First World War, and the creation of the league was a centerpiece of Wilson's 14 points of peace. The First World War did a lot to help promote all this. It got people. A lot of people didn't like. Lost any interest in getting involved, because at the beginning of the First World War, all the nations were really pumped up about getting involved. It was just, they were so excited about this war getting going and a chance to go fight for their country. But once they got into the trenches and the stalemate, and the artillery was being fired at them, and everything, then it would become a horror, and they hated it. And the longer it just dragged on, they would fight one battle after the other, and it would just take thousands upon thousands of casualties with no benefit, no gaining of ground, nothing. With just basically no results, but with millions, with thousands upon thousands dead with no results. And it was just a repeating process over and over, year after year. People just finally got tired of it and wanted the war to end. And this helped forward the League of Nations to bring all nations together to say we can make sure this will never happen again. But it did not work. Specifically, the final point stated: a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. Before drafting the specific terms of the peace deal, Wilson recruited a team led by Colonel House to compile information deemed pertinent in assessing Europe's geopolitical situation. In early January 1918, Wilson summoned House of Washington, and the two began hammering out. In complete secrecy, the President's first address on the League of Nations, which was delivered to Congress on January 8, 1918, Wilson's final plans for the League were strongly influenced by South African Prime Minister Jan Christian Smuts, who in 1918 had published a treatise entitled The League of Nations, A Practical Suggestion. According to F.S. Crawford, Wilson adopted both the ideas and the style of Smuts. On July 8, 1919, Wilson returned to the United States and embarked on a nationwide campaign to secure the support of the American people for their country's entry into the League. On July 10th, Wilson addressed the Senate, declaring that a new role and new responsibility has come to this great nation that we honor, and which we would all wish to lift to yet higher levels of service and achievement. Support, particularly from Republicans, was scanty at best. The Paris Peace Conference, convened to build a lasting peace after the First World War, approved the proposal to create the League of Nations on January 25, 1919. The Covenant of the League of Nations was drafted by a special commission, and the League was established by Part 1 of the Treaty of Versailles. On June 28, 1919, 44 states signed the covenant, including 31 states which had taken part in the war on the side of the Triple Entente, or joining it during the conflict. Despite Wilson's effort to establish and promote the League, for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in October 1919, the United States did not join. Opposition in the Senate, particularly from Republican politicians Henry Cabot Lodge and William E. Borah, and especially in regard to Article 10 of the Covenant, ensured that the United States would not ratify the agreement. The League held its first council meeting in Paris on January 16, 1920, 6 days after the Versailles Treaty came into force. In November, the headquarters of the League was moved to Geneva, where the First General Assembly was held on November 15, 1920. And you can just see all that bringing about a world government, bringing about world peace, which is another part of the coming of the tribulation period, and the world government. You can see world government, world peace. It's all bringing about the Antichrist kingdom. All this is leading towards it, bringing all the nations together. Next one, I'm going to discuss the United Nations.